Okay, so we have this development in the cultural West, which is different from the development in the cultural East. In the cultural East, you have these really ancient traditions. And in the cultural West, you have similar traditions that are being constantly repressed by the Roman Church. And then, we have the Copernican Revolution, which is this way of looking at the world that comes from the onlooker separation that appears first in the West. And it dominates the thinkings of the early natural philosophers, the way they looked at the world. They started to look at the world not as something they participated in, but as a thing over there. And they began to study the things of the world through their senses. Anyway, this impulse, this way of knowledge that we call science, was a significant way. It's basically a spiritual way, even though it ends up producing materialism. It's fundamentally a spiritual way when it's properly understood. Because it's a way of knowledge. It's a way of finding universal elements of existence. And the fact that it's gotten a little confused is totally understandable. And that's sort of a whole other story. But here we're looking at the cultural East versus the cultural West in a kind of way, and recognizing that into the stream of development of the cultural West arises natural science. And this natural science begins to be encountered by people who are, shall we say, priests, initiates in the king's wisdom, which is being suppressed. The alchemists are understood to have certain approaches that were similar to science, and a lot of the early understanding of chemistry came from the things that were done by people who called themselves alchemists. Isaac Newton was an alchemist. Johannes Kepler was an astrologer. People in those early days of science participated both in religious thinking and scientific thinking, and they didn't really see that there needed to be a difference. Anyway, eventually there's a confluence of what might be called the king's stream of wisdom, that is, the ways of gnosis, the ways of direct experience of the divine, and the scientific impulse. And this occurs at the end of the 19th century. In the 19th century, natural science became dominant as something that's creating for general humanity pictures of the world. In the 19th century we have Darwin's theory of evolution, which people are pretty much enamored of. We have, Newtonian physics, at least. It's going to last for a few more years. Once the 20th century starts, Einstein brings forward his ideas of relativity, and then you get into quantum mechanics and indeterminacy. Newtonian physics kind of goes out the window. But at the time of the 19th century, there was a lot of power in natural science. But the one tendency in natural science that was kind of unfortunate, you could say, in a way, was that it had taken a view, and this is developed historically in Ernst Lehr's book Man or Matter, and also somewhat in Barfield's writings, that how this came about, that only matter existed and there was no reality to spirit, and that everything about human existence could be explained by explaining the nature of matter. Now I'm going to get into that over in the section on proof of God. I'm going to get into the technicalities of it. Right now I'm just talking about meditation and action as a good example, modern example of the tradition of the East as it lives today, and living, thinking, and action, which is the thing that happens when you marry science to an interest in the development of spiritual life. And this was done in a particular way by a man named Rudolf Steiner, and in my section on anthroposophy, real anthroposophy, you can find discussions of that. It should also be understood that he wasn't the only person to do this. in Thoreau and Emerson and Coleridge and Goethe and all kinds of personalities that we call the Romantics and the Transcendentalists, you have an instinctive understanding of the potential latent in thinking, the spiritual potential latent in thinking. And this is one of the reasons that I describe the influence of the East as a kind of pollution, because it wants to suggest that thinking can't do anything. It's sort of stuck. If you're going to do meditation, you abandon thinking. And this is actually not what the most developed people in the West teach. And in fact, one of the big distinctions between teachings in the West that have the same quality and discipline as the teachers of the East that we don't recognize yet. Nobody recognizes these people as profound spiritual teachers in the same way that we recognize Zen masters and Tibetan lamas and stuff, It's just not in our contemporary vocabulary yet. But the fact is that one of the reasons this is so is because in the cultural West, the goal is not enlightenment. The goal is not self-development. Self-development is a means by which you do something else. And that's why the self-development in the West involves the metamorphosis of thinking. And this metamorphosis is brought by the individual out of themselves, out of their own activity, through developing an introspective science. That is, we become scientists of our own minds. We don't adopt willy-nilly traditions out of the East, which are very ancient and have a lot of old and somewhat tired ideas about the nature of the ego or the I, for example, and are inadequate to the real nature of the I in the present, because the I has continued under the influence of the Creator to evolve and is not something like it was when these traditions were established. And I'll get into a little details on that in a minute. I'm just trying to get the idea that through Rudolf Steiner, for example, we have 3 books that were the second, third, and fourth books that he published. And they're all about giving us maps, you might say, to those processes in which the individual can engage that causes a transformation of thinking, a metamorphosis of thinking, such that thinking now is able to spiritualize all the conceptual life. Whereas in mindful meditation, the kind of meditation that one hears about from the East, where one doesn't have thoughts, in the West, one not only has thoughts, but one learns precisely how thought is manifested and how to transform the inner will so that the thinking that is done, the living thinking that is done, is able to transform all aspects of human knowledge. And this is what unites the way of knowledge that is natural science with a spiritual understanding. Know thyself is what the Greeks said. And so Rudolf Steiner in his books, A Theory of Knowledge Implicit in Goethe's World Conception, Truth and Knowledge, and the Philosophy of Spiritual Activity, gives us the means to cause a metamorphosis of thinking and make it a spiritual activity.